Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Versus. And tonight I am welcomed by a great guest, a returning guest to Versus, my father, Tim Huish. Tim, welcome back.
Thank you. Glad to be back.
Yes, as you can tell by his sign and by his hat, we're going to be talking Devils tonight. Sun Devils, that is. We're going to be talking about Arizona State football as we have a big game ahead of us this Saturday. So, Tim, let's just get right into it. It's the hottest ticket in college football right now. I mean, how much were you telling me you were seeing tickets go for, and how much were people willing to pay you for your tickets? Because you're going to be there on Saturday.
I will be there on Saturday, like I've been for the last 20, 25 years in the stadium, rooting on my Devils. Tickets are crazy. I've seen and heard people spending thousands of dollars per ticket in the lower bowl. Where I sit, I like to sit a little higher, so I like to sit in the upper bowl, but on the kind of the lower part of the upper bowl, where I've sat for the last 15, 20 years. Those seats are going for $300 to $400 a pop. But no chance of me selling those tickets and not going to the game tomorrow or on Saturday.
Yes, it does sound, and this isn't just like local media hyping up the hottest ticket in town. This is like nationally, this is one of the hottest tickets because this is virtually a Big 12 title elimination game. Now, obviously, there's tiebreakers in play if BYU were to lose, but basically the winner of this game, their odds of making the Big 12 tournament go into like the 80%, 85% range, even with 1 week left. So with that, let's just get right into it. As a Sun Devil fan, and we like to consider you, Dad, our Sun Devil insider. Have you done any watching of BYU this year? Are you familiar with how they play, or am I going to be shedding some light for you as I live up here in Orem, so I've kind of been de facto watching BYU this year as I've had colleagues and classmates talk about them. What do you know about BYU?
I don't know. I would say I'm not obviously as close to BYU's program as I am to ASU's. I do know a little bit about it. I have watched portions of their last few games because they've been on at a time where really I didn't have anything else that I felt like watching. So I did watch their loss last week to Kansas. Probably half of that game. I watched probably a quarter or a half of the game previously, and then I've seen some of the endings because they've had some really crazy endings of games where they've been able to pull games out at the very end. So I've seen a little bit about them. I know a little bit about their quarterback. He seems to be the one that gets them going. It's a lot rides on his arm and on his legs, I would say. And then I know he's got a couple of receivers. I know Roberts is kind of his favorite target. And then I know defensively they fly around. Looks like they fly around a lot, especially their linebackers seem to be really good. And they always seem to have good lines on the offensive and defensive side. So I think it's going to be a fun game.
Yeah, I agree. That's basically what you're saying. It's basically a summary of what I've heard. Basically, their team's success relies a lot on Jake Retzloff. They have a very physical running back, LJ Martin, who isn't nearly getting as many touches as many people thought. I think last week against Kansas, he had 15 carries. And his stats are kind of deceiving. But when you look at his carries per yards, I mean, he's up there 4 yards a carry. But they haven't really been going to him as late. They've been letting Retzloff throw the ball. And and then what you said about defense, that's kind of what I've gathered too. They fly around. They do a good job of stopping the run. Their linebackers are super versatile. And I think it should be fun. I think it's going to be a fun, physical game. I think the atmosphere is going to be something that I don't think Arizona State's had in, fair to say, a decade, with how There's a lot of BYU alum, a lot of BYU fans in the Valley. They're going to be going there, and I'm sure many of them bought tickets when they weren't hundreds of dollars, like you were saying, before both teams have greatly exceeded expectations. So, in your opinion, then, is getting Cam Scadaboo back going? Is that the key to success for you this weekend against the Cougars, or do you think there's maybe a couple different ways ASU can pull this one out?
I think the best thing that I've noticed about ASU over the last several weeks is the continued progression and improvement of folks that are not Scattaboo.
Mm.
So Sam Levitt has really picked up his game. I think he's probably one of the top quarterbacks in the Big 12. And he's so young, but every game he seems to get better, making better decisions, rarely puts the ball in harm's way, is a willing runner when he needs to run. And Jordan Tyson's been just incredible. And I also think the thing that they don't get enough credit for is not just their line, but their receivers block. And so if you get creases, if you get separation, that's why we get those chunk yardage plays, is because everybody's a willing blocker, and it's really team football first. But with that being said, don't get me wrong. I think they're going to give Scattaboo the rock a lot this week. I don't think last week was a very good indication as to who he really is. I think that injury he had the week previously was still lingering a little bit. I noticed several times he would go to the sideline and just kind of need to breathe a little bit. And so he's healthier this week. And so if he's 100%, I would expect a big day out of Scat.
Mm. Me too. Yeah, I really like what you said about the team blocking and not just the offensive line, who is probably the most experienced group out of all the position groups on the football team, but also the tight ends and the wide receivers do a great job of blocking. I think that goes back to who's the wide receiver coach right now. One of the best blocking wide receivers in the last 30 years in the NFL out of Hines Ward.
Yep.
And I think he preaches that, and he's able to back it up, and guys can watch his film and say, dang, this guy was a great blocking wide receiver. And I think it inspires them and rallies the offensive unit to say, you know what, let's block so we can get big gains, big yards, and explosive plays.
Well, their line has a motto. I mean, their receivers have a motto. I don't know if you've heard it or not.
Yeah.
But Hines Ward has thought, no block, no rock. But I love the motto. Hey, if you're not going to block, you're not getting the rock. You're not going to play. So.
Yeah, that is awesome. I love that. So there's been a lot of hype about this game, especially now with Arizona State winning. There's been a lot of talk about this is the biggest game at Sun Devil Stadium, or now Mountain America Stadium, since, and then you fill in the blank, whether you want to say since the Herm Edwards era, since the Todd Graham era, since the Dirk Cutter era. Where would you rank this game in terms of stakes, importance, and I would also just throw in atmosphere. Like, when's the last time that you think there was a game this hyped? I think I have an answer, but I want to hear your answer.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely been a while, and the previous regime, which will remain nameless, there was never a game that I felt like rose to this level of magnitude, either from an importance perspective or just overall hype perspective. I think some of the hype, obviously you're talking about two teams that are battling for position to get to the Big 12 championship game, as you mentioned earlier. So I think that's part of it. But also the other part is this is the first year that BYU and ASU are in the Big 12 together. So this is the first time they are playing a football game each other in the same conference for the same thing. I think since back in,
I think it was the 70s when they were in the WAC together.
Yeah, back in the WAC, right? Before ASU went to the Pac-10, the original Pac-10. So It's been a long, long time since they've been in the same conference. Um, but they have played, just not very frequently. And in football, I think the last time was in the 90s, when they played here at ASU. Now, I know they played at BYU, but the last time they played here, I think, was in the 90s. Um, and so it's been a long time. So there's the fact that it's an important game from a conference perspective, but and you said it at the beginning, there are a lot of BYU graduates and BYU fans in the Valley. So I think it's going to be really interesting. I think that's what's increased the hype even more is there's there's a rivalry. I wouldn't say necessarily between the schools, but there's a rivalry between a lot of the fans,
Mm.
that either love or hate one university or the other. And so I think that's what a lot of it is stemming from as well is the fans. I think the players are probably less so because they haven't, played each other consistently in a long time. But I know from a fan's perspective, there's a lot riding on it because, people you see at work or people you see in your neighborhood or maybe at church or wherever else, um, there could be some bragging rights on the line. So it makes the game even more important.
Yeah. So where would you put this then? It sounds like you're painting this is a very unique, specific instance where a hype about a game this late in the
Yeah,
season has reached the level it's at. If you were to compare it to a game in the past, maybe recent year, or maybe you got to go back to the 90s,
yeah,
how would you compare this?
yeah. I would say so. And you said it right. It's different. If you were to say hype for a game in Sun Devil Stadium, I mean, when Notre Dame came here 10 years ago, that was a huge hyped game, and we played fantastic and won. If I remember right, it was like 44-20 or something like that. It was a really big win. And that was just simply because it was Notre Dame and they hadn't been out to ASU in a long time, or maybe ever. I don't recall. Um, but that one was really hyped. Then, obviously, the year that we went to the Pac 12 championship game, the game right before that, we had to win in order to get there. That was a very hyped game. But again, it was in conference, was a game we should have won, and we did. So I would say that there's been this much hype around the Valley and the desire for tickets. It hasn't been this way. That Notre Dame game was a tough ticket, but I would say the last time I remember a ticket being so tough was when Nebraska came to ASU during the Rose Bowl year of 1996, and we were able to beat Nebraska here at home. I remember probably a third to maybe close to a half of the stadium was red.
Mm.
And so a ton of Nebraska fans there when we won that game. And I anticipate that we're going to see something somewhat similar. Um, I will be there in my gold, loud and proud, and the people with me, but I'm expecting a lot of blue, and potentially white, whatever color they're wearing this weekend. I expect a lot of it.
I think what you say is fair. And for those young bloods who don't know why that Nebraska game was so big, Nebraska was back-to-back national champions, I believe, and they had a
Yep.
20-odd game win streak going. And it was the first week of the season, and ASU said,
It
"We'll
was
take this one."
actually a few games into the
Oh,
season.
games into the season, yes, thank
Yeah.
you.
But yeah, we gave them their first loss in like 30 some games. You're correct, and two national championships, and they came in thinking that they were going to destroy. Because the year before we played them in Lincoln, and it was like 70-14 or 16-20 or something like that. We got our doors blown off, and then the following year they came into our place, and to beat them 19-0 was pretty impressive. So
Yep. So you mentioned one of the games that I would probably compare to in terms of magnitude and maybe similar hype. I think what you've said is true. The fact that there are a lot of BYU fans in the Valley, and this is the first time in a really long time that both teams have been good. And
yeah,
not just good like preseason, like 9-1 and 8-2. If I had to compare it, I would say this is probably ASU's biggest game at home since the Notre Dame game, because Notre Dame at the time was ranked, I believe they were number 10 in the nation, and ASU was somewhere in the teens, kind of like where they are now, early 20s, late teens. It was a day game.
Mm-hmm.
Notre Dame fans, similar to BYU fans, travel very well, and they
Yep.
seem to be everywhere. And it had some writing for college football playoff potential. That was the first year of the college football playoff. And after ASU won that game, ASU got to number 6, and they were the second team out of the ranking with 2 weeks left. Of course, we don't need to relive how the season ended, but that was probably the last time that a game of this magnitude in terms of postseason play was played at home. But if I had to compare it last time, I mean, I was like you, I was in that stadium for the Notre Dame game. It was palpable, I would say, because of the postseason implications with the playoff, as well as the traveling fan base of Notre Dame. But again, I think there's way more BYU fans in the Valley than Notre Dame. So even that's only comparable because of the type of school it is. It's a private school. The fans are everywhere. But that's what I would say. Last question I have for you is about moving forward. So, like we've talked about, after including this week, there's only 2 weeks left in the regular season. And then you've got postseason implications, and we don't know how it's going to turn out. They could have 3 games left. They could have 5 to 6 games left. Who knows? Moving forward, though, in the year 2 of the Kenny Dillingham era, what do you think needs to happen moving forward in order for Arizona State to keep the success, the surprising success, I'll say, so early in Kenny Dillingham's tenure? Do you think there's one thing they need to do? Do you think there's a couple things they need to do? Do you think it all ties back to the same thing? What do you think Arizona State needs to do moving forward to continue to have the success they're having right now and to be what a lot of people around this program think, which is wake the sleeping giant, which has been asleep for 30 years?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and Kenny himself has talked a lot about this over the last week or so. And my thought process is very similar to what he is thinking. I think number one is retention of staff, right? So when you win, um, other teams want coaches off of your team. And so the ability for Kenny to be able to retain his staff, which usually that is 90% about money and then maybe 10% about opportunities. So I think there's going to have to be some funds raised to retain his staff, or at least a large portion of his staff. I think the critical ones are the offensive and defensive coordinators for sure, and then several other folks within the either the offense or defensive systems. So retention of staff to me is number one, because the staff has done a really good job of not just bringing in the right players, but also helping the right players get better game to game, week to week, and year to year. So I think that's number one. Number two is I believe we have found a quarterback, right? And quarterbacks are hard to find. And when you find them, you got to keep them. You got to do what you can do to keep them. Because we've lived many years with mediocrity at quarterback. And when you have mediocrity at quarterback, it's hard to win consistently. And so, as important as Scat's been to the program, Sam's been just as important and probably more important into the future. As you know, Scat runs out of eligibility this year. Sam still has 3 more years of eligibility after this year. And so retaining Sam, retaining a lot of the key important young players around him will also be critical. And the good news is there's, from a recruiting perspective, I would say, especially here in Arizona, there are a lot of kids in Arizona that weren't high-level kids in Arizona that weren't considering ASU 2 years ago, or would have never considered ASU 2 years ago, that are now considering, and some have even already committed into the 25 and 26 classes. So I see some wave happening there, but that's all contingent upon continuing to win. and continuing to win is contingent upon retaining your good players and keeping and retaining your good coaches. To me, it's pretty much that simple.
Yeah, I agree, and you could hear why Kenny's talking about his assistants. Jake Plummer today was on Arizona Sports, and he said something that's really cool about Kenny is Kenny's at his pinnacle destination.
Yep.
Every job Kenny has taken has led him to want to come back and coach at Arizona State. Yep. Kenny's not using his platform at Arizona State to try to go to Alabama or Michigan. He's not trying to go anywhere else. This is where he's wanted to end up, and he probably got here sooner than he thought. And he's thinking, man, if I just keep doing a good job, I could be here 30 years. Yep. I could become like a Nick Saban. I can become a Dabo Swinney, a head coach who's going to be here a very long time and is going to have extended success. And so I think because he's so happy where he's at, he understands that it's not about him. It's about keeping his staff, like you said. And I think that's going to be really important.
Yep. Well, the good news is on the quarterback front, I don't know if you saw, but his dad came out this week and talked about how happy Sam is at ASU and that his goals coming to ASU were to win the starting quarterback job and then to grow and develop here and be at a place where he can be successful, win, and prepare himself for the NFL. And his dad came out and said, it's exactly what we can do at ASU. Why would we want to go anywhere else?
Hear it.
So it was a powerful support from his dad. So he said Sam isn't going anywhere.
Oh, love to hear that. That's awesome. But yeah, that covers everything I wanted to talk about. Tim, thank you so much for your time tonight. Appreciate your insights. Appreciate your perspectives on the current state of Arizona State football. And thanks again for coming on. Yes, go Devils. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Versus podcast. This has been a Versus podcast episode, a Scripture and Sports podcast with your host, Slaton Huish. For our guest, Tim Huish, I'm Slaton Huish signing off, and we'll see you guys in the next chapter.